In the middle of a stormy night, the cold and domineering man cast his wife and child out of the house without a hint of hesitation. He had no idea that the very woman he discarded was holding a secret that could drag him into a nightmare with no escape. "You filed a complaint against me while still living in my house." Dan Carter stood blocking the kitchen doorway, his eyes locked on the stack of papers in Sarah's hand. His face had turned red, not from the whiskey, but from fury. Sarah froze in the middle of the room, her breath caught tight in her chest. Ethan, 6 years old, sat at the dining table, a crayon still clutched in his fingers. The boy didn't make a sound. His eyes moved between his mother and father, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. "It's not a complaint," Sarah said softly. I'm thinking about Ethan's future, that's all." "Enough." Dan snatched the papers from her, glanced over them, and threw them to the floor. "You're taking me to court? After living off my money for 10 years, now you want a piece of this house?" Sarah didn't answer. She just looked down at the pages lying near her feet, stained with a faint orange smudge. Dried juice from Ethan's breakfast that morning. Dan Carter, 45, a real estate investor in Portwood, Oregon, was once a successful man. Now, he was becoming a hollow shell, defined by power and control. Sarah had loved him. That was a fact. Sad, unfortunate, but true. 10 years ago, she'd been a nurse with a gentle smile, working night shifts at a remote clinic in the hills. She met Dan at a fundraising event. Back then, he was charming, quick with a joke, always wearing that grey cloth cap she used to find endearing. Love ended when they moved into this house, not all at once, but slowly, year by year, like rust. In the second year, she quit her job because Dan told her, "I can take care of us. You stay home. Focus on being a good mother." By the fourth year, she started feeling like she no longer had any worth in this house. By the sixth, he banned her from using credit cards and shut down her accounts. And this year, the 10th, she filed a petition to keep the house for their son. Not to win, but to make sure he'd have a place to stay if everything fell apart. And just as she feared, everything was falling apart. Dan brushed past her, snatched his phone. "Rick's on his way. You'd better be gone before he gets here. I don't want to drag this out. I've got an appointment at 8. Sarah bent down to pick up Ethan's little coat. She meant to ask one more question, something to confront him, to hold on to a shred of dignity, or just to force him to look her in the eye and see what he was doing. But Dan's eyes, hollow, detached, like he was making a business decision instead of talking to the woman who had stood beside him for 7 years, stopped her cold. She said nothing more. No question was worth that kind of indifference. Her hands, trembling, fumbled with the tiny buttons on Ethan's coat like they weren't even her own. Her fingers were numb, her nails cracked and bloodied from hitting the door handle earlier. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he knew something was wrong. He didn't see her car in the driveway. There was no dinner on the table, and now his mum was bundling him up while his dad shouted like she was a stranger. "I don't want to go," Ethan whispered, his voice nearly lost in the folds of his coat. He clutched her wrist, his eyes glistening. "I know," Sarah said softly, drawing a deep breath. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "We're just going out for a little while." Outside, the rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was heavy and dark. Sarah walked with Ethan down Evergreen Street, the same street they'd strolled together in the fall, watching the yellow leaves drift down. Now there was only wind and cold pavement. No doors opened. The lights inside houses still glowed, but every curtain was drawn tight. Mrs. Gloria, her elderly neighbor, stood behind a window across the street. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and then the curtain fell back into place. Sarah didn't blame her. She knew in this town no one dared interfere with the Carters. Dan wasn't just wealthy, he had friends in powerful places. "I'm cold," Ethan murmured, pressing his face into her chest. "I know, baby," she said. "I know." Sarah tightened her grip on her child's hand and quickened her pace. But where could she go? She had no phone, and her bank card had been frozen long ago. Dan called it a safety measure, so she'd stop making impulsive purchases. Her car, the one her parents had left her, had been sold without her even knowing. What did she have now? A child and an empty canvas bag. Thunder rumbled over the distant hills. Sarah glanced up. The rain was coming. Near the edge of town, the streetlights began to thin. The wind picked up, sweeping the leaves into twisting little whirlpools. Ethan started coughing. Sarah scooped him up, though her back ached, and carried him deeper into the black pine woods. A narrow path emerged between two rows of trees, the one she used to hike back in high school. Now, it was all she had left to hope for. She moved like someone unmoored, her feet sinking into the soft, wet ground, knees scraped from tripping over roots. Ethan drifted off in her arms, his head growing heavier by the minute. And still she kept going, not knowing what waited ahead. She wasn't thinking about a destination. She wasn't thinking about an end. And she couldn't have known that these seemingly aimless steps were leading her into something else entirely. A journey no one had mapped out, no one was waiting for, but one that would upend everything she thought she knew about herself, about others, and about what it truly means to live freely. An owl swooped silently into the clearing, leaving a few white feathers snagged on a brittle branch. No sound followed, except for the wind brushing through the forest grass and the wet fabric of Sarah's coat swishing against her as she walked. The ground beneath her feet had turned tacky, thick, each step dragging behind it a memory heavier than her own weight. Ethan was running a mild fever, breathing fast, his fingers clutching at her shoulder, shivering now and then in brief, uneven bursts. The glow from the town had disappeared entirely behind the towering trees, leaving only scattered patches of moonlight filtering through the thick canopy, glinting off the ferns tucked in for winter. Sarah no longer thought about turning back. She kept her eyes forward, as if stopping, even for a second, might shatter her completely. Suddenly, a rotted sign emerged to her left. 4 blurred words. Cedar Creek, no trespassing. She stood still before it for a few seconds. Not from fear. She was simply too tired. Her canvas shoes were soaked through. Her coat, now wrapped around Ethan, left her drenched, as though she'd just climbed out of a stream. She bent down slightly, her voice barely more than a breeze through cloth. "Ethan, are you still awake?" "My head hurts. Mommy." Sarah held Ethan close as they crossed into the woods, the old warning sign brushed aside. The path led over a stream and past fallen trees. The night, heavy with an unsettling silence. Tree shadows stretched like retreating hands. Then, a faint golden light in the distance. A cabin appeared behind a pine, smoke from the chimney, an axe in a log, nets by the door. It wasn't inviting, but it didn't warn them off either. At the steps, Sarah set Ethan down, steadied herself, and knocked 3 times. Waited, then knocked again. The light inside shifted, a faint creak. The door cracked open, just an inch. A man appeared, flashlight in hand, eyes squinting against the glare. He said nothing, just looked. Sarah stood up straight, unable to hide her exhaustion, but she still tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my son has a fever. We have nowhere else to go." The man said nothing, only lowered his flashlight to the boy lying still. Ethan whimpered softly, turning his face away as if trying to disappear into his coat. Sarah waited, her heart beating slow but heavy. "I don't help strangers?" His voice finally came, rough and low. Not angry, but firm. "Just one night. For my son." Sarah clutched the bag in her hand tighter, her eyes locked on his. He went quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door a little wider and stepped back. "Come in." The cabin was small but warm, just wood, metal and stone. Simple yet tidy. A man handed Sarah a blanket. "Keep the boy warm. I'll get medicine," he said, calm but not unkind. Sarah sat on the floor, cradling Ethan, her hands trembling as she gave him the medicine with quiet precision. The man returned with water and a basin, said only, "You can sleep on the couch. I'll be in the back," then left without asking questions. She didn't need him to. As the door closed, she rested her forehead against Ethan's. His fever was easing. The wind still howled outside, but inside that wooden room, something fragile had begun to thaw. Not tears, just the first hint of safety. Not gratitude. Just the emptiness in her chest no longer felt quite so hollow. The next morning, as the pale sunlight crept through the window, Sarah opened her eyes. Ethan was still asleep, one small arm wrapped around his mother's waist. The man was sitting at the table, his back turned, reading a thick book bound in leather. There were 2 cups of tea on the table, one of them cold. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. He didn't turn around, just nodded. "Lucas?" he said, as if answering before she could ask. Sarah stayed quiet, gently brushing her child's hair. Everything was still unclear, but what happened last night was real. In a world full of closed doors, someone had opened one for Sarah, and she never imagined the quiet man in this cabin would become such a turning point in her life. Lucas sat at the table, his figure outlined by the soft glow of an oil lamp. The air smelled of pine wood and faint ash, holding the quiet warmth of a night shared with a stranger. Unwashed plates sat nearby. An open book lay untouched. By the stove, Sarah curled around Ethan, the boy tucked into her chest, fists clenched in sleep, a habit from infancy. Lucas glanced at them, then looked down at his scarred hands, the old wound on his finger aching in the changing air. "Are you going to sleep?" Sarah asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rose, poured water into the kettle. The iron hissed as it met the heat. "I usually only sleep when the sun's up," he said quietly. He sat down in the chair across from her, hands resting on his knees, the posture of a man used to waiting out storms. Lucas looked at Sarah for a long moment. "I don't know if I should ask this, but what made you and the boy leave?" Sarah looked up, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. She spoke slowly, each word seeming to be drawn painfully from deep inside her chest. "My husband, he's a lawyer, good at what he does, well known, respected in town. But at home, he controls everything. The finances, the phone, who I see. Even my thoughts feel chained. He never hit me, but that didn't make it any easier. When I asked about opening a separate account for Ethan, he looked at me like I was a criminal. 3 days later, he threw us out, me and my son, into the rain, with just one bag between us." Lucas said nothing, but his eyes softened. She went on, "I brought a folder with me. Copies of emails, contracts, notes he'd signed, things that, if made public, would ruin him. I didn't dare go to court. No lawyer. No one would believe me. So I ran." Lucas's voice dropped low, a quiet empathy wrapped in restraint. "I've needed a place no one could find me too. Not because I was afraid people would know who I was, but because I was afraid they wouldn't care." How long have you been here? 7 years, since my wife died. She overdosed during a simple outpatient procedure. Hospital's fault, but no one took responsibility. I was changing the brake pads on a Chevy when it happened. I didn't get there in time. After that, I sold the garage, scraped together everything I had, bought this land, built this cabin with my own hands. Been here ever since. Then why are you helping me now? Lucas looked down at his hands. I'm not sure, but that's what I felt when I saw you and that boy. That sense that someone needed help. And if I didn't help, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Silence stretched between the crackling of the fire. Sarah glanced out the window. There was only fog and a few tree branches whispering in the wind. She spoke, her voice barely more than a sigh caught in her throat. I think my son and I should leave in the morning. I don't want to be a burden to you. Lucas stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the darkness outside the door. His voice came low and steady, not a command, just the truth. It's not safe. These woods hold worse things than you might think. Sarah furrowed her brow. What do you mean? Wolves, bears. But the real danger doesn't come with teeth or claws. It comes from people. He turned the pipe slowly in his hand. A lot of different kinds pass through here, some good, some with bad intentions. You're used to safe places. Here, you can't afford to let your guard down. If you want, you can stay a while. Learn how to survive. Stay safe first. Sarah said nothing. Part of her was afraid, but another part believed him. She looked at Ethan, asleep and peaceful, then turned back to Lucas. You think he'll come here? That man? Maybe. If you're holding something, he needs badly enough. Sarah swallowed hard, not from the cold, but because, for the first time in days, she realized she'd just brushed up against the thin line between the instinct to survive and the need to trust. Aren't you afraid? She asked. Lucas answered simply, 7 years was long enough to teach me how to protect myself from that kind of fear. At the same time, on the 3rd floor of Carter Tech, Dan Carter stepped into his office, rainwater soaking the shoulders of his coat. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of a computer screen casting light across the desk. Dan went straight to the safe, unlocked it, and pulled out a black folder where copies of property ownership contracts, internal emails, and sworn statements never meant to see daylight were kept. But as he flipped to the last page, his eyes stopped cold. An empty envelope. A single sheet of paper, ragged at the edge, torn unevenly. Dan shot to his feet and slammed the folder onto the desk. He spun around and yanked open the second drawer, empty. Sweat started to bead at his temples. He yelled, "Rick! Get in here, now!" Rick Monroe, who'd been standing just outside, walked in, his face calm, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. "The documents. She took something from my safe," Dan said through clenched teeth, fists tightening at his sides. Rick furrowed his brow. "You mean those files?" "Emails, contracts, legal memos. She's got everything she needs to bury me if she brings it to court, and if that's what she plans to do, we don't have much time." Dan turned toward the window, where the lights of Portwood blurred beneath the rain. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes wild, like an animal who'd just realized its den had been breached. "Find her. I don't care if you have to tear this whole town apart. And if it comes to it, erase her trail. All I need are the documents and the child." Outside the glass, the city shimmered in a haze of red. And for the first time, the chase wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was about power and the terror of being exposed. At Portwood, reporter Craig Delaney was live-streaming in front of the county courthouse, the gloomy building looming behind him, with a ticker running below. Ex-wife of CEO Carter missing with son. Kidnapping motive. His eyes gleamed like a predator spotting prey. Last year, Dan had fed him a series of fabricated documents, doctored copies of old psychological evaluations, a few spliced audio recordings that painted Dan in a favorable light, and an anonymous letter accusing Sarah of being unstable after giving birth. Craig used them to write 3 consecutive articles published under the column Women and Hidden Dangers in the Modern Family. Those articles had triggered an internal investigation at Sarah's workplace. She had nearly lost custody of Ethan. Her reputation and career both took a nosedive. Dan never had to show his face. He simply stood behind the bold, sensational words in print. For Craig, this wasn't just news. It was a transaction. Dan gave him exclusive intel, smooth access to Portwood's upper crust. In return, Craig turned the paper into a stage where Dan always played the part of the betrayed, sympathetic father. He did it for notoriety, for sponsorship money, and for that particular thrill, the rush of standing atop someone else's collapse, especially women who once dared to refuse silence. Rick arrived at the Portwood police station just before noon. The ceiling was low, and the air carried the mingled scent of stale coffee and damp paperwork. Still, this was the place where the most critical decisions in the small town were made. Lieutenant Mark Grayson stepped out from the back office. He was in his early 40s, with a quiet, grounded demeanor, and a face that looked like it had weathered fire and smoke. "Rick," Mark nodded. "It's been a while." Rick pulled a photo from his coat pocket, Sarah and her son, standing in front of a conference hall. "She disappeared last night. Dan asked me to look, to take care of the boy." Mark took the photo, studied it closely. No signs of coercion. "No one's seen them since after 10 p.m. It was raining. That's enough to file a missing persons." Mark was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Any complaints filed?" "Restraining order." Rick hesitated, then shrugged. "So, but you know where Dan's friends are?" Mark gave a slight nod. "I'll take a look." Late afternoon. The Grayson house, down at the end of Maple Street, smelled of white chrysanthemums and faint sunlight. Laura was folding towels in the kitchen, her hair loosely tied, a few strands falling against her neck. When Mark walked in, she didn't look up, but her hands paused for a beat. "Have you eaten?" "Not hungry." Mark sat down and laid the photo of Sarah on the table. "She's missing. No official report yet, but Rick's already looking." Laura leaned in, studied the picture, then exhaled. "Dan Carter again?" Mark nodded. She grew thoughtful, then spoke slowly. "Rick doesn't look for people. He picks up what Dan leaves behind." "Where would she hide?" Laura answered, like she was recalling something familiar. "A place with no signal, no lights, and no one patient enough to go looking." "The woods?" "The woods, or deeper than that. A place she'd only go if she was more afraid of herself than of him." At the office of attorney Ed Huxley, a retired judge once known for handling internal settlements, Dan was reviewing every line of the case file. "You sure about this?" Ed asked, eyes still on the papers. "If Sarah doesn't show up in court, you win. But if she does, and she has the right paperwork..." Dan leaned back in his chair. "I've already handled Craig Delaney. The public thinks she's unstable. They won't trust a mother who's been accused of mental issues and runs off with her kid." Ed raised an eyebrow. "Still playing the old cards?" "They work." Ed slid the file back across the desk, his expression unchanged. "She's still got friends, and if one of them's stubborn enough to step up..." Dan smirked. I don't think anyone's dumb enough to try. Mark returned to the station and opened the internal records. He typed each word with deliberate care. Sarah Mitchell, Carter, minor, Ethan, last seen, unknown. Beneath Dan's name was an old note, flagged more than 3 years ago. Case involving CEO Carter's ex-wife. Media narrative likely skewed. Recommend investigation into Craig Delaney. Possible compensation received for spreading false information. Mark read the line over and over. For a moment, the office felt heavier, as if the air had thickened. He murmured, "He doesn't need Sarah to come back. He just needs enough rumors to make people turn their backs on her." And while the words continued to ripple across social media, a small footprint had just pressed into the wet earth near the northern edge of town where the forest began. Slow, steady. Sarah Mitchell had stepped into the shadows, that place where only those who have lost all reputation, all place to return to, finally dare to search for themselves again. The morning at the cabin began with the soft crackling of the stove and the smell of smoke drifting through the gaps in the wooden walls. Sunlight filtered through the frost-covered window, casting a blurred glow on the wooden table in the center of the room. Sarah was the first to wake. She quietly tucked the blanket back around Ethan and stepped out of the sleeping nook. Lucas was sitting out on the porch, idly spinning an old hunting knife in his hand like it was second nature. When he saw her, he gave a small nod. "Any chance you've got coffee?" Sarah asked, her voice husky but trying to sound cheerful. Lucas pointed toward the pot on the stove. "You can help yourself, though it's not exactly the kind of brew for someone who just rolled out of bed like me." Ethan woke not long after, eyes still groggy, but perked up the moment he saw Lucas setting up to build a fire. "Can I try?" Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up. Lucas gave a soft chuckle. "Give it a shot. Wind's calm today. Should catch easy." Ethan crouched over the firewood, fumbling a bit as Lucas gave quiet instructions. The fire caught, then flared to life, its glow reflecting off the boy's face. Sarah stood still, not interfering, watching as if witnessing something precious, something she hadn't dared to hope for in years. After breakfast, Sarah set to cleaning. She reorganized the drawers, wiped the windows, then opened the wooden cabinet near the corner of the room. A picture frame slipped out from behind a toolbox. In the photo, a little girl with messy hair and a toothy grin stood beside Lucas, looking younger then, clean-shaven, and with eyes that hadn't yet grown heavy. She didn't ask. She simply placed the frame back where it had fallen, then gently closed the cabinet. By noon, Sarah was simmering a stew made from dried goods and wild greens Lucas had gathered the day before. The three of them ate right there on the wooden floor, no fancy table, no matching silverware, but it was warmer than any candle-lit dinner she'd ever known. Lucas told Ethan about simple trapping techniques, about wind direction, and why, in the forest, silence could mean the difference between life and death. Ethan listened intently. Sarah, meanwhile, quietly committed every word to memory, not to learn, but to hold on to something ordinary in a life that had become anything but. A few miles away, Rick Monroe moved slowly along the bed of a dry creek in the middle of the black pine woods. Each step was heavy but deliberate. His eyes scanned left and right, missing nothing. Not a snapped twig, not a faint depression in the dirt. Every rustle of leaves made him pause, not from fear, but from the instinct of a man used to hunting danger. He crouched low, rough hands peeling back layers of damp, decaying leaves. On a low shrub, a mud-streaked ribbon hung snagged, light blue, frayed at the edges, still damp from the rain. Rick picked it up, rolled it between his fingers like it was a piece of evidence. He brought it close to his nose and sniffed quickly, a habit left over from his old days with a private investigations team. Then, he slipped it into a Ziploc bag, sealing it with care. A thin smile curled across his lips, like he'd just heard a silent confession. "You didn't get far, Sarah," he whispered, voice slick as motor oil. "I'm close now." That evening, Lucas stepped outside before the light was fully gone. He stood by the narrow stream behind the cabin, listening. A branch cracked against the grain of the wind. An unfamiliar boot print marked the damp soil. He made no sound, just crouched down and touched the ground with his fingers. Cold, not yet dry. When he came back inside, his eyes were sharper. Sarah saw the change in them, even though Lucas said nothing. "What is it?" she asked. Lucas sat down and pulled off his mud-caked shoes. "I can't say for sure. But tonight, if you're still uncertain, let the wind blow through once more. Then decide." Sarah sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the fire, casting flickering shadows on the wall. After a long pause, she whispered, "Is it possible that staying could also be a way of moving forward?" Lucas looked up, his voice slow and warm, each word seeming to carry the hush of the forest's breath. "There are places we're meant to leave. But then there are others, where if you find yourself breathing a little easier, maybe that's where you're meant to stay." Inside the cabin, Ethan slept soundly, his arms still wrapped around his mother's shirt. Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the dark forest. A torn canvas, it seemed, each rip a path that might lead to danger. And while the cold wind outside whispered through the leaves, the small fire in the wooden cabin kept burning. Not brightly, but enough. Enough for 3 quiet souls to believe. Morning would still come. Evening settled slowly over the black pine forest. The sun didn't quite set. It dissolved behind the branches in patches, casting a dark, orange, chilly light across the damp ground. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine resin, sometimes carried in soft, whistling gusts of wind that sounded almost human, like a whistle, with no whistler. The wooden cabin sat small and alone in that space, seeming even smaller, more fragile, like a candle flickering toward extinction in the dusk. Lucas carried an oil lantern and a hunting knife as he followed the narrow trail down toward the stream. He'd seen the footprint last night. This morning, with the ground dry, he'd returned to make sure it wasn't an animal or a stray hiker. Beneath a fallen log, he crouched and picked up a piece of crumpled foil, a cigarette wrapper, still faintly scorched. Marlboro Silver. People in these woods didn't smoke that. Anyone who'd been here long enough rolled their own, or used a wooden pipe. Lucas stood still for a moment, fingers turning the grimy paper over, then slipped it into his coat pocket. The wind sliced through the treetops, chapping the skin on his face. He looked up toward the horizon. Nothing there, but it no longer felt like peace. A few hundred yards away, in front of the cabin, Sarah sat on the front step, keeping an eye on Ethan as he played with twigs and stones. The boy was nearly 6, but in that moment, he seemed smaller, laughing when the pebbles bounced from his hand, frowning as the wind tousled his hair. A dry branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Sarah turned her head sharply and stood up. Nothing but the forest. Still, that sound hadn't come from the wind. It was clean, abrupt, like someone stepping on it, then stopping. She pulled Ethan inside the house, heart racing, palms cold with sweat. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder. "Mum?" I heard a crackling noise. It was just a dry branch. "Get inside." Night came earlier than usual. The sky was covered in thick clouds, casting the whole forest into twilight not long after afternoon passed. Lucas set up a few more bell traps around the cabin, tin cans strung on wire, stretched at adult eye level. He showed Sarah how to unlock the folding knife, how to cut wire, and how to stay completely silent when a sound broke the stillness. "Sometimes sound is just a cover," Lucas said, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the door. "What's scarier is what it's hiding." Sarah gave a small nod, her fingers tightening around the knife's handle like she was clinging to something more real than fear. Inside the cabin, Ethan didn't sleep deeply. He shifted, restless, calling for his mother in his dreams, his voice tight with fear. "Is he here yet? Is he going to take me?" Sarah sat beside him, holding him closer. "No one's taking you anywhere. I'm right here. And so is Uncle Lucas." Lucas stood by the door, listening. Then, quietly, he stepped outside. The moon was dim, the trees rustling in the breeze. He didn't believe in omens, but nights like this, no moon, no strong wind, yet the air filled with that low, humming stillness, usually meant something was coming. Sarah sat for a long while after Ethan drifted back to sleep. She stared into the fire, then out into the darkness beyond the window. It didn't feel as safe as it had the night before. The air felt heavier, not from the cold, but from an old instinct she'd ignored for years, the feeling of being watched from the shadows. Lucas stepped in, knocking the mud off his boots. He sat down by the window and checked his old gun. Sarah watched him for a moment, then asked, "How long did you live in the woods?" 10 years, on and off, but I remember the seasons clear as day," he replied, still focused on the trigger. "You weren't afraid?" Lucas gave a faint smile, eyes still on the gun. "I was never afraid of the woods. I'm afraid of the ones who carry the woods with them, and still haven't learned how to be quiet." Sarah nodded slightly, then sat down across from him. The firelight cast a slanting glow across their faces, two figures not quite familiar, but beginning to share something deeper than a few days of shelter. Then Lucas asked, suddenly, "If tomorrow morning I told you and Ethan to move, to somewhere deeper, harder to find, would you go?" Sarah was quiet. After a long pause, she said, "I used to run without knowing where I was headed. Now, if I have to go again, I need to know who I'm going with." Outside, about a mile from the cabin, Rick Monroe stood at the edge of a clearing, watching the faint firelight in the distance through night vision binoculars. He wasn't in a hurry. He'd learned patience from the best. A silenced rifle was slung across his back, an old map was tucked into his coat pocket, and in his ears, a voice from memory still echoed, "Find the right place, the right people, the right time. After that, it's all patience." He tightened his grip on the binoculars, then crouched and pulled out a small device, a thermal scanner. On the screen, 2 red blips, one large, one smaller, blinked close together. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from the cabin. It smelled real. "Closer than I thought," Rick murmured, then stepped back into the trees. Inside, where the fire's dim light danced across the grain of the wooden walls, a man and a mother were learning how to trust each other, before the world, once again, forced them to run. The sky was pale and damp with mist, like a thin coat of silver paint brushed over the peak of black pine. Dew still clung to the leaves, dripping down in soft ticks against the earth, like a countdown no one could hear. The cabin remained still in the woods, but inside, 3 people were already up. Lucas packed some dried rations and a lighter into a cloth bag, then handed it to Sarah. "If you had to leave in 5 minutes, what would you take?" Sarah opened the bag, counted silently, then replied, "Knife, water, fever medicine for Ethan, the forest map, and a photo of me and my mum." Lucas nodded without judgment. He slung an axe over his shoulder and motioned for the mother and son to follow the trail eastward, toward the edge of the forest. where he dug a small hollow beneath the dry trees to stash emergency supplies. In case we have to run, this is Plan B. Sarah followed quietly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Ethan trotted beside her, carrying a small stick to trace lines in the dirt as they walked. When they reached the spot, Lucas showed Sarah how to set a simple trap using wire and a bent branch. She picked it up quickly. Her hands trembled at first, fumbling with the rope, but soon grew steady. Lucas stood close, showing her how to tilt the blade just right, how to balance as she pulled the wire taut. "This'll only hold something for a while, but if it's cold enough and we've got time, it might save your life," he said. Sarah nodded, exhaling like someone releasing a fear that had been sitting too long in their chest. "I never thought I could do things like this." Lucas looked at her, voice calm. "You always could. No one ever taught you, that's all." On the way back to the cabin, they paused beneath a canopy of trees. Ethan stood on tiptoe, looking up at a brittle branch, then turned to Lucas. "Uncle Lucas, the girl in the photo. Where is she?" Lucas paused. Sarah turned too, ready to stop the question, but Lucas raised a hand. "It's okay. Her name was Maggie. She was my daughter." Ethan blinked. "Where is she now?" Lucas sat down, broke off a twig, and rolled it between his fingers. Maggie used to love the forest. Her favorite thing was to stand in the middle of the tall pines and look up, watching the sunlight flicker through the leaves. One time, while I was fixing a car for a regular client, a big trucking company that delivered around here, Maggie went outside to play. Just for a minute. But she wandered off, made it all the way to the main road. A truck came, red logo, C&D Logistics. I'll never forget that name. The driver was drunk, never even slowed down. By the time I heard the brakes, it was already too late. Sarah sat still. A flicker of shock passed over her face, because Lucas didn't need to say more. In her mind, an old news report resurfaced, faded, but never forgotten. The accident involving a drunk driver, a truck owned by a freight company that had once been sued and then quietly settled, and the same company Dan Carter had hired as a logistics partner that year. "No, it can't be," she whispered. Lucas looked up. "You know something?" "My ex-husband used a company like that. I remember the name from a contract he kept hidden. I only saw it once, when he printed the wrong page." Lucas squinted, not in anger, but like a man trying to fit together two jagged pieces of a long disjointed life. "I used to think about revenge," Lucas said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping wood, eyes fixed on some far-off place. "I imagined standing face to face with the man who ordered that truck, demanding justice. Some nights I couldn't sleep, just turning over ways to make him lose what he loved most, the way I did. But then I realized, no matter what I did, Maggie wasn't coming back. And if I took that step, I'd lose whatever part of me was still human." By late morning, they returned to the cabin. Sarah fixed a simple meal, while Lucas worked on the door hinge. Ethan pulled out an old book to read, but just a few minutes later, a sharp sound from the woods brought them all to a halt. A gunshot rang out, not close, but clear. The sound rippled through the trees, echoing like a blow to the chest. Lucas stepped to the door, eyes alert. That wasn't hunting, and it wasn't a trap going off. That was a warning. Sarah pulled Ethan close. "He's coming." Lucas nodded. "He didn't fire at the cabin. Means he wants to scare us off, not destroy anything." Sarah looked toward the woods. Inside her coat sleeve, the documents wrapped carefully in plastic were still there. Power of attorney forms, copies of joint assets, and emails Dan had signed himself, the ones he'd used to silence her with money and influence. She felt like she was back at the beginning, being pushed, cornered. Only this time, she wasn't alone. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep in the corner of the bed, Sarah sat by the fireplace, arms wrapped around her knees. The flickering light cast long shadows on her face, deepening the tiredness in her eyes. She spoke quietly, not looking at Lucas. "You know, I've lived for years without really breathing. Every time I thought I was free, I'd just find another place to hide. Like if I could just disappear, then everything else would fade too." Lucas sat down beside her, saying nothing. The firewood cracked gently, like the forest whispering just outside. Sarah went on, her voice soft but steady. "But today, watching Ethan playing under those trees, hearing that gunshot, I knew. I don't want to disappear anymore. I don't want to run. I want to end this. I want to take something back, for myself and for my son." Lucas rested a hand on the armrest, his gaze not on her, but on the fire, where the flames danced and glinted against the calluses on his fingers. "Then this time, we don't run." The night wind returned, colder than the night before, but inside the cabin, where 3 people sat silently side by side, the only thing trembling now was no longer fear, but a fragile trust, beginning to take root in the very heart of danger. And when trust begins to turn into a weapon, the only thing they need is time. Time to use it when it matters most. Morning in Portwood. The sky was a dull grey, and a thin mist clung to the windows of the police station. Officer Mark Grayson pressed the button to send data from his personal USB drive, bypassing the department's internal system. The old files loaded quickly, a complaint filed against Dan Carter 3 years ago. A case quietly settled after a private meeting, with the accuser resigning soon after. Mark sent the file to Abby Lane, a freelance attorney he'd worked with on several domestic abuse cases. He included a note. "I believe she's in danger. This is just the tip of the iceberg." Abby Lane received the email with a coffee cup still in her hand. Her eyes quickly caught the signature, Sarah Mitchell. A property transfer agreement, no attorney present, no witnesses, and signed just a week before she disappeared. In it, Dan was granted full access to all assets should Sarah be declared legally incompetent. Abby picked up the phone immediately. "I need the original case file for Mitchell versus Carter, 2021, both the unilateral affidavit and the settlement transcript. And can you check for me, has any restraining order been filed recently?" Less than an hour later, Abby left her office, case folder in hand, and drove straight to the office of a retired judge, someone who had once denied Dan's appeal. She scheduled an emergency consult hearing. That same afternoon, Rick Monroe pushed open the door to Carter Tech. Dan sat motionless in the conference room, eyes cold. He didn't touch the glass of whiskey sitting in front of him. Rick tossed a Ziploc bag onto the table, a small scrap of cloth smeared with mud and dry leaves, along with a few quick phone snapshots, still warm ash, rope tied in a backwoods style. "I tracked them close to a clearing, fresh ashes, even a child's footprints. Unless something's changed, they're holed up within 10 miles, somewhere around the southern meadow. Bet there's a cabin nearby." Dan's voice was tight. "I need an emergency order. The child is my son, and what she's carrying, that could destroy the entire company. Without a court order, going near her is kidnapping." Dan cut in, sharp and low. "Then find Huxley. Draft a custody petition claiming the mother's mentally unstable. Add a clause, seize any unverified materials. I've got a hearing for temporary guardianship in 48 hours. Before then, I need everything." Out in the woods, a light rain had started to fall. Sarah scribbled a letter, her hand trembling, but the words clear. She slid it into a plastic sleeve and handed it to the man delivering supplies, a grizzled old hunter, an old friend of Lucas's. "Can you get this straight to Laura Grayson?" The old man nodded, his voice raspy. "I'll leave tonight." The letter read, "Ethan and I are safe. We haven't left the state. I have proof. Please don't trust Dan. Help me." Lucas returned to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the treetops. He set his knife on the table, but there was something else in his hand. A cold, empty shell casing, its dull brass streaked with forest mud. "There was a shot," he said, voice low. "Came from near the southern meadow. Wasn't aimed at anyone. More like a signal." Sarah rose quietly, folding the small cloth beside the stove. "Does that mean he knows where we are?" "Not exactly, but he knows enough to rattle us. He's camped below the stream, not even trying to hide. It's like he's counting our footsteps." Sarah glanced toward the window, the trees shifting in the last light, trembling, though there was no wind. "Are we leaving?" Lucas shook his head and sat down, eyes on the fire. "Not yet. If we run now, we hand him the advantage. But we can't just sit here either." He looked up at her, his voice clearer. "Tonight, I'll set more traps around the clearing. You gather the essentials. Dried food, maps, medicine. We need a way out, but we're not running." Sarah nodded. For the first time in days, her eyes reflected more than just worry. There was something almost calm in them, as if she was learning how to stand tall in the middle of a storm. In an office in Portland, Abby opened the newly received file. The contract showed obvious edits, with no witness signature. Below it, a leaked internal Carter Tech memo documenting Dan's use of company funds for personal expenses. She emailed Mark. "If Sarah still has the original copy, we've got a chance to turn this around. But I need to see her as soon as possible. Send me coordinates, any trace you've got." At the same time, at the cabin, the fire still burned. Sarah watched Ethan sleep, his small hand curled tightly around the button on her shirt. Outside, a flicker of light glowed in the forest, coming from the tent Rick had just pitched, like an eye waiting for the right moment to act. None of them said another word. But in the silence, one thing was certain. No one was willing to run anymore, and the truth, at last, was demanding to be named. On a rainy night, the black pine forest became something else entirely. A living thing, damp and cold, hissing with every gust of wind slipping through brittle branches, so deep that even footsteps were swallowed into the mulch of rotting leaves. The small cabin where the three of them took shelter now seemed like a lone spark floating in a sea of darkness, at once their last safe haven and an open target for anyone who might be hunting them. Lucas sat near the window, a loaded hunting rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line ahead. He had set up extra traps at the edge of the clearing, not enough to stop a well-armed group, but enough to buy a warning. Beside him, Sarah was rinsing out the pot of still warm soup, her hands trembling slightly from the chill, slipping through a gap in the doorframe they hadn't yet sealed. Ethan had dozed off in a chair, clutching the thick coat Lucas had given him. Suddenly, a streak of searing red slashed across the sky like a blade of fire, a flare. The sharp hiss of ignition was followed by a soft pop. Lucas shot to his feet and yanked the curtain aside. Another flare launched from the edge of the forest, near the creek. Its red glow cut clean through the rain, driving straight into the heart of anyone still awake. "We have to go," Lucas said quickly, his voice stripped of hesitation. "They know we're here." Sarah scooped Ethan into her arms, wrapping a blanket hastily around his small frame. "The tunnel?" Lucas nodded and ran to the back of the cabin, lifting up a wooden floorboard. Beneath it was a narrow crawl space leading to an old storage cellar tucked deep beneath the tree roots, a passage he had once dug to stash supplies for the winter. Footsteps echoed in the distance. It was unclear how many people there were, but enough for Lucas not to take any chances. He slipped down first, pulling Sarah and Ethan after him. When the floor panel was set back in place, the cabin appeared empty once again. Outside, the flickering light of a campfire was drawing closer. They huddled together in the old root cellar below ground. The wooden ceiling hung low, and the air was thick with mildew and the faint scent of old ash. Sarah held Ethan, who was trembling softly, his eyes shut but murmuring in a daze, "Don't let him take Mom." "Don't go, Mom." Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "We won't stay here long. When daylight comes, we'll head north, through the ravine, out toward the old town. There's an old service road. I stashed a pickup there." Sarah gave a slight nod. Her eyes no longer held tears, only a steady resolve, rare in someone who's already lost too much. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Abby. "I have the evidence, but you have to come forward. The appeal only holds weight if you appear. I can request witness protection, but we have to move fast." Sarah read it over and over, her hand clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. She turned to Lucas. "If I go, will Ethan be safe?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy, then said quietly, "If there's one reason I'd step out of hiding after all these years, it's to protect that kid." At the same time, over at Carter Tech, Rick was giving his report. The cabin had been found. No one had been seen, but clear signs of recent activity remained. Dan listened in silence, his fingers tapping lightly on the glass tabletop. "The emergency custody order will be in place by morning. If she shows up, the police will be required to hand the boy over to me." Rick frowned. "What about those documents? What if she brings them when she surfaces?" Dan answered without a moment's hesitation. "She wouldn't dare. And if she does, I could counter-sue for illegal possession of internal documents. That way, I control the narrative, and she's the one on the defensive." Early dawn. The rain had stopped. In the old storage shed, Sarah watched Ethan sleep, then reached for the small leather pouch. Inside were papers she'd held onto for 3 years, a coerced statement, an unsigned property contract, and 2 printed emails she had secretly copied from Dan's computer. She had kept them all this time, only to remind herself of what not to forget. Now, they had become something that could change everything. Lucas lifted the hatch and looked up at the sky. The fog was thick, but the rain was gone. He glanced down and gave a small nod. "It's time." Sarah zipped up Ethan's jacket and whispered, "Sweetheart, I need you to be stronger than ever." The boy opened his eyes, still half asleep. "Are you scared, Mum?" Sarah smiled, tears slipping out, but her voice stayed steady. "Number, because you believe in me. And so does Uncle Lucas." Lucas stood still for a beat, then opened the hatch door. The light from the forest spilled in, dim, but enough to see the old trail leading north. The cabin behind them was now just a place that used to be home. Ahead of them waited a confrontation, not to flee from, but to end everything with the truth. Early that morning, after crossing the rocky pass and a dew-slick gravel path, Sarah, Lucas, and Ethan reached the outskirts of Portwood's west side. Silent, they stopped in an old parking lot where a dust-covered moss-green pickup waited. Lucas checked the engine and map. Sarah gently placed Ethan in the back seat, covering him with a blanket. The boy murmured in his sleep, his head resting on her shoulder. "Are you sure this is the safest way?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "Mark Grayson's the only cop I still trust. If he sees the truth, he won't turn you in." At the Portwood police station, Lieutenant Mark Grayson looked up as Sarah walked in, child in arms, Lucas beside her, weary and worn. The room fell silent. A young officer nearly spilled his coffee. Mark stood and slowly stepped into the lobby. "Sarah Mitchell?" Sarah nodded. Her voice was small. "I'm turning myself in voluntarily. I have the evidence." Mark's eyes shifted to Ethan. "Is the boy okay?" Lucas answered, "He needs rest." "But he's not hurt." Mark led them into a private room. He locked the door, drew the blinds, then exhaled. "I don't know what you've been through, but if what Abby Lane sent me is true, Dan Carter will have to answer for it." Sarah placed a worn leather bag on the table and carefully unpacked folders. Handwritten letters, coerced contracts, bank statements, photographs showing psychological abuse. Lucas added a copy of an old accident report, Carter Logistics named in the file, along with proof of a behind-closed-doors settlement. At Attorney Abby Lane's office, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. The printer hummed non-stop. Abby had just received word. Judge Huxley had been temporarily suspended over suspected bias and tampering in the Carter case. She immediately called Sarah, urgency in her voice. "A new judge has been assigned. One independent. If you're ready to come forward, I can request an emergency hearing." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I've been in the dark too long. It's time to step into the light." Portwood Town Courthouse, later that afternoon. The hearing room was small but packed. Media hadn't arrived yet, but word had spread among independent attorneys and townspeople. Dan Carter sat on the plaintiff's bench, his face expressionless. Rick Monroe was absent. No one had seen him since morning. Sarah walked in holding Ethan's hand, Abby at her side. Lucas took a seat in the back row, quiet and steady as a shadow. Acting Judge Judith Callan opened the file and spoke plainly. "Does Ms. Sarah Mitchell have documentation to support her legal custody of the child, as well as evidence of coercion or threats by the plaintiff?" Abby nodded. "All documents have been filed, and we call our witness, Lucas Brennan." Lucas stepped up to the stand. His face was calm, but his hand shook slightly as he gripped the microphone. He recounted the accident that took his daughter, Maggie. Each detail was clear. The truck belonged to Carter Logistics, the driver was intoxicated, and a settlement had been quietly reached just 3 days later when a lump sum was wired through a third party into his and his wife's bank account. The room fell silent. Sarah sat beside Ethan, her gaze fixed on Lucas, not with fear this time, but with a certainty that, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Dan Carter surged from his seat, his voice cold. "Your Honor, I object. This witness has no direct connection to the custody dispute. His testimony is emotional, not legally relevant." Abby turned to the judge. "We've submitted the original accident case file, along with a sworn statement from the lawyer who handled the settlement. This isn't just testimony. It reveals a pattern. Mr. Carter uses money to control people, including his ex-wife." Dan's hands gripped the sides of his chair. He snapped at Sarah, voice sharp. "She was diagnosed with postpartum anxiety. I can provide her medical history. Someone like that shouldn't be raising a child." Abby stepped forward. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "We've contacted the hospital directly. There is no official diagnosis, no treatment record, no prescription or therapy regimen on file. The only thing Mr. Carter has is an anonymous letter from 3 years ago and spliced audio clips used in an unverified article by a journalist currently under investigation." Judge Judith Callan looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carter, you're making a serious accusation without legal grounds. Unless you can produce verified medical records, I will consider this an attempt to defame the defendant's character." Dan's voice rose in a growl as he stood. "She's lying to the court." The judge met his eyes, steel in her gaze. "Mr. Carter, one more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt." Dan froze, then dropped back into his seat. Behind him, Lucas remained standing, his fingers clenched tight around the strap of his bag. No one else needed to speak. The weight of truth was thick in the air. Judge Callan closed the file. Based on the submitted evidence, the verified testimony, and the plaintiff's failure to present medical documentation, the court issues a temporary ruling. Custody is granted to the mother, Sarah Mitchell. Furthermore, a protective order is in effect for her and her son, while the case proceeds to higher investigation. From the gallery, Ethan reached for his mother's hand. He looked up and whispered, "Mom, we don't have to hide anymore, do we?" Sarah bent down, kissed his forehead, tears spilling as her lips curved into a smile. "That's right, sweetheart. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Lucas stepped closer. Sarah turned to him, her voice soft with fragile hope. "Will you stay?" Lucas didn't answer right away, but his eyes did. Behind them, the courthouse faded into the pale glow of sunset. But ahead was the first true light any of them had seen in what felt like forever. Lucas moved beside them. The borrowed suit jacket hung awkwardly on his broad shoulders, still dusted with pine needles. But his gaze had never been steadier. Sarah turned again, her hand still resting on Ethan's back, and asked once more, barely above a whisper, "Will you stay?" Lucas looked at Sarah, then Ethan, seeing in the boy's eyes all he had once lost. There was no hesitation, only a quiet resolve. He gave a small nod. He'd made his choice. And this time, he was staying. Behind them, the courthouse faded into dusk. Streetlights blinked on, slowly, gently. Ahead, a softer light waited. Not from justice, but from the trust shared between three souls who had survived the darkest night of their lives. For the first time in a long while, they walked forward, together, toward something new. Not to hide, but to begin something else, something none of them had dared to hope for, until today. In the shadows of power and silence, Sarah had chosen to step into the light, not because she was braver than anyone else, but because she could no longer bow to what was wrong. This wasn't just a story of escape. It was a journey to reclaim voice, dignity, and the right to live in truth. Lucas, a man who had once lost everything, had learned how to believe again, and Ethan, just 6 years old, reminded the grown-ups that courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means holding your mother's hand, even in the storm. Sometimes, maybe, doors close, so we can find a path we never dared to see.